New map shows where California will fall into the ocean by 2050. The idea that California could one day be underwater is not as far-fetched as it may seem, though not in the dramatic way some imagine. Climate scientists have warned for decades about the dangers of rising sea levels, and according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, the state faces a considerable threat. Yet, despite these alarming projections, a persistent myth continues to circulate that California could break off and fall into the Pacific Ocean. This sensationalized idea, rooted in misunderstandings about earthquakes and tectonic activity, overshadows the real threat posed by climate change. Rising sea levels. Let's take a closer look. Debunking the myth. Will California crack and fall into the ocean? One of the most persistent myths surrounding California is the notion that the state will someday crack along the San Andreas Fault and plunge into the ocean. This idea, often sensationalized in movies and media, is grounded in a fundamental misunderstanding of tectonic activity. The San Andreas Fault is a transform fault, meaning the tectonic plates on either side slide past each other horizontally. While this movement can result in significant earthquakes, it will not cause California to fall into the ocean. In reality, the state's landmass is moving horizontally rather than sinking. What makes this myth especially misleading is that it conflates the real geological risk posed by earthquakes with the separate issue of sea level rise. Earthquakes have the potential to cause localized damage, but they are not responsible for the gradual sinking or erosion of land. Instead, it's coastal subsidence and erosion that pose more immediate threats. As sea levels rise, the coastline erodes, and some areas of California experience land subsidence, where the ground sinks due to natural processes or human activities like groundwater extraction. These factors contribute to the shrinking of the coastline, but not in the dramatic fashion of the state plunging into the ocean. The real concern for California's coast is not tectonic activity, but the long-term effects of climate change. Rising sea levels combined with coastal erosion are slowly reshaping the state's shoreline. While it's true that earthquakes will continue to be a hazard for residents, they won't cause the kind of apocalyptic scenario where the state is severed from the mainland. Instead, the gradual encroachment of the sea will likely be the cause of more immediate and lasting changes to California's geography. Sea level rise projections by the IPCC and NOAA. The most pressing issue facing California's coastline today is not earthquakes, but the steady rise of sea levels driven by climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, has provided alarming estimates on how much the ocean could rise by the end of the century. Their projections range from 43 to 84 centimeters, 1.4 to 2.8 feet, depending on future carbon emissions and global efforts to mitigate climate change. In a worst-case scenario, a rise of up to 2 meters, 6.6 feet, is possible. This might not sound catastrophic at first, but even modest increases in sea levels have far-reaching consequences. Coastal areas that are already vulnerable to flooding during high tides or storms would face significantly greater risks. The loss of beaches, the destruction of homes and businesses, and the contamination of freshwater sources could become routine occurrences. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, echoes the concerns of the IPCC, projecting that a sea level rise of just 3 feet would have devastating consequences for California. The agency's projections suggest that some of the state's most densely populated and economically important areas, such as Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego, would be severely impacted. Low-lying areas that already experience coastal flooding would see these events occur much more frequently and with greater intensity. Even without the full extent of the IPCC's dire predictions, a 3-foot rise in sea level would be enough to inundate roads, airports, and critical infrastructure, putting millions of people at risk. Compounding the problem is that California's coastline is uniquely vulnerable to the Pacific Ocean's natural fluctuations. The state experiences dramatic shifts in sea levels due to tidal cycles, weather patterns, and the El Niño effect, which brings storms and high waves to the coast. Combined with the steady global rise in sea levels, these natural phenomena could produce particularly severe and frequent flooding events. Experts warn that these factors, along with projections of future sea level rise, suggest that California will see widespread and potentially irreversible changes to its coastal regions unless significant mitigation efforts are undertaken. Impact of climate change on California's coastline. The impact of climate change on California's coastline is already being felt, but the coming decades could bring even more drastic changes. Rising global temperatures have accelerated the melting of polar ice caps and glaciers, causing more water to flow into the world's oceans. In addition, as water warms, it expands, a process known as thermal expansion, contributing further to the rising sea levels. California's 840-mile coastline, famed for its beaches and cliffs, is particularly vulnerable to these changes. Over time, erosion will eat away at the coast, shrinking beaches and cliffs, while rising waters creep further inland, threatening homes, businesses, and vital infrastructure. One of the most immediate effects of sea level rise on the coastline is the accelerated erosion of beaches. Coastal erosion has always been a natural process, but the added pressure from rising seas has sped up this cycle. Beaches that once provided natural barriers against storms and high tides are shrinking, leaving coastal cities more exposed to the elements. This, in turn, increases the risk of flooding, especially during extreme weather events. Coastal highways, homes, and utilities built close to the water are at particular risk of being damaged or completely destroyed as the ocean moves inland. In addition to physical infrastructure, ecosystems along the coast are also in danger. Wetlands, which provide critical habitats for wildlife and act as natural buffers against flooding, are at risk of disappearing entirely. As sea levels rise, these ecosystems face the dual threat of being submerged and squeezed out of existence by human development. Wildlife that depends on these habitats, including birds, fish, and other marine species, may lose their breeding grounds and food sources. The loss of wetlands would also mean the disappearance of a vital defense against storm surges and flooding, making coastal cities even more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Rising sea levels will also lead to more frequent and severe coastal flooding, particularly during king tides and storms. These extreme tides, which occur a few times a year, are already causing temporary flooding in low-lying areas. As sea levels rise, these events will become more common and more destructive. Coastal cities like San Francisco and Long Beach are already seeing the effects, with streets and properties regularly inundated during high tides. Looking ahead, this is just the beginning of a long and costly battle against the forces of nature as the ocean continues to reshape California's iconic coastline. How will sea level rise affect communities? Sea level rise is not just a threat to the natural landscape of California. It directly affects the millions of people living in coastal communities. As water levels climb, many of these areas will face regular flooding, displacing residents and disrupting daily life. Major cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego, home to millions of people and critical infrastructure, are among the most at risk. Coastal neighborhoods, particularly in low-lying areas, will see homes damaged or even destroyed by recurring floods. The consequences go beyond the immediate physical damage, as residents will be forced to contend with the long-term instability of living in areas that will become increasingly difficult and costly to protect. Economic consequences will be another devastating result of sea level rise. Property values in coastal regions could plummet as the risk of flooding increases, and homeowners might find themselves unable to insure their properties. This loss of property value could ripple through local economies, leading to reduced tax revenues for cities and counties, which depend on property taxes to fund essential services like schools, police, and fire departments. In addition to residential damage, businesses located near the coast will face heightened risks. From the tourism industry, which relies heavily on beach access, to ports and shipping facilities critical to California's economy, many sectors will struggle to adapt to the changes brought by the rising ocean. Furthermore, the social impact on communities will be significant. In many cases, it will be lower-income neighborhoods that face the harshest consequences. These areas, often already located in more vulnerable, low-lying regions, may lack the resources to protect themselves from flooding. The cost of mitigation measures, such as raising homes or constructing barriers, will be out of reach for many, leading to the displacement of large numbers of people. This could result in a humanitarian crisis as communities are forced to relocate, leaving behind the homes and livelihoods they've known for generations. For many Californians, the question will not just be how to protect their property, but whether they can remain in these coastal communities at all. Preventative measures and mitigation strategies. While the threat of rising sea levels looms large over California's coastline, there are several measures being taken to mitigate the damage and protect communities. Coastal cities are investing in a variety of defensive structures, including seawalls, levees, and tide gates, designed to hold back the encroaching waters. These man-made barriers, while effective in the short term, often come with high costs, both financial and environmental. Seawalls, for instance, can lead to increased erosion in neighboring areas and damage to marine ecosystems. Yet, for many cities, the urgency of rising tides leaves them with few alternatives beyond fortifying their defenses. Beyond physical barriers, California is also employing more natural methods to combat the effects of climate change. Beach nourishment programs, which involve adding sand to eroding beaches, have been used to maintain the coastline and protect against storm surges. Restoring wetlands and marshes is another strategy gaining traction. These ecosystems act as natural buffers, absorbing excess water and reducing the impact of floods. However, both solutions are temporary, requiring ongoing maintenance and resources to keep pace with the relentless rise of the ocean. At a governmental level, California is leading the charge in climate change legislation aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions and slowing the progression of sea level rise. The state's ambitious cap-and-trade program, alongside its push for renewable energy sources like wind and solar, aims to cut emissions and set an example for other states and nations. These efforts, while vital in addressing the root cause of climate change, will take decades to produce noticeable effects. In the meantime, the focus remains on adaptation strategies that can safeguard vulnerable areas in the near term. One of the more controversial approaches to dealing with rising sea levels is known as managed retreat. This strategy involves moving infrastructure, homes, and even entire communities away from the coast to higher ground, allowing the ocean to reclaim vulnerable areas. Though it's seen as a last resort, managed retreat may become an unavoidable reality for certain parts of California, where the cost of defending the coastline becomes too great. The challenge, however, lies in convincing communities to abandon land that has been occupied for generations. Whether through physical barriers, ecosystem restoration, or the difficult decision to retreat, California is grappling with how best to address the inevitable rise of its waters. Now it's time to hear from you. Do you think we'll be able to reverse the effects of climate change? Let us know in the comments section below.